The outdoor wedding reception glowed under string lights draped between towering oak trees, the late afternoon sun casting golden shadows across manicured lawns. Crystal glasses caught the light as guests in designer gowns and tailored suits mingled on the terrace, their laughter mixing with the gentle melody of a string quartet. Near a marble column, barely visible among the sea of celebration, sat a 10-year-old girl in an ivory silk dress, her wheelchair positioned where she could see but not be seen. Nobody noticed her watching the dance floor, where her mother smiled and chatted with the city's elite. Then a man in a worn dress shirt paused, looked around, and asked a question that would change 3 lives forever. Why is she alone? The contrast between their worlds had never been sharper than in this moment. Ethan Walsh carried the weight of 38 years in his calloused hands and the lines around his eyes, each mark earned through late nights fixing electrical systems in office buildings across the city. His 8-year-old daughter Lily sat beside him at a corner table, her second-hand party dress carefully pressed, her hair braided with the kind of patience that came from being someone's entire world. They were here because of an old friendship, a college roommate who'd climbed different ladders, but Ethan felt the familiar sting of not quite belonging. He watched Lily's eyes widen at the elaborate ice sculpture, at the servers carrying silver trays, at a world she glimpsed but would never inherit. This was the life he couldn't give her, and the knowledge sat heavy in his chest like stones. Across the reception, Vivienne Roth moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of someone who'd learned to command rooms before she'd learned to command her own heart. At 35, she was everything the business magazines said: brilliant, beautiful, ruthless when necessary. Roth-Tech's quarterly reports spoke of her success in numbers that most people couldn't fathom, but numbers had never explained why she stood alone even in crowds like this. Her daughter Claire had been the center of her universe once, before the accident 4 years ago left them both changed in ways that medical reports couldn't capture. Now Claire sat in her wheelchair, receiving the best care money could buy, but missing something that no amount of wealth could purchase. Vivienne told herself she was protecting her daughter from disappointment, from the world's cruelty, from hope that might be crushed again. But protection, she was learning, could look remarkably like abandonment. The two parents lived their separate struggles in the same city, their children growing up in parallel universes of want and wealth. Ethan's apartment was small but filled with evidence of presence: crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, a reading corner with mismatched pillows, a jar of coins they saved together for Lily's college fund. He bandaged scraped knees with cartoon bandages, read bedtime stories with different voices for each character, and folded origami cranes from newspaper when Lily needed to make wishes on fallen eyelashes. His love was measured in time given freely, in attention paid without distraction, in the way he listened when she talked about playground politics with the seriousness of international diplomacy. Vivienne's penthouse was a monument to everything Claire might need: physical therapists, private tutors, the latest adaptive technology, a full-time nurse who managed every aspect of her daughter's care with professional efficiency. She provided everything except the one thing she'd forgotten how to give: herself. Since the accident, Vivienne had poured her energy into creating a fortress of security around Claire, hiring experts to handle what she no longer trusted herself to manage. She attended meetings about Claire's progress, signed checks for equipment, and made decisions about her daughter's life from boardrooms and car phones. But she hadn't sat on the floor to play a game, hadn't read a bedtime story, hadn't simply asked about Claire's dreams in so long that she'd forgotten what her daughter's natural laugh sounded like. The moment Ethan noticed Claire was the moment everything shifted, though none of them understood it yet. He saw what everyone else had learned to look past: a child sitting alone while adults celebrated love and family around her. He saw the careful way she held her hands folded in her lap, the practiced stillness of someone who'd learned not to draw attention to her needs. When he approached, Claire looked up with the startled expression of someone unaccustomed to being seen. Her face had the pale quality of too much time spent indoors, but her eyes held the bright intelligence that no accident could dim. She was beautiful in the way that children are beautiful when they're trying very hard to be invisible, and Ethan's heart broke a little for all the ways the world had taught her to shrink. "Hi there," he said, crouching down to her eye level. "I'm Ethan. That's my daughter Lily over there, the one with the braids." Claire followed his gaze to where Lily was carefully folding her napkin into what might become a flower. "She's shy too, but she makes friends with origami. Would you like to meet her?" Claire nodded, and for the first time all evening, someone asked what she wanted instead of what she needed. When Ethan wheeled her chair toward their table, positioning her where she could see everything. Claire smiled with the rusty quality of something that hadn't been used in too long. Lily looked up from her paper flower and immediately began teaching Claire the folds, their heads bent together over the makeshift craft project. Two children finding each other across the vast divide of their different worlds. The scene might have been perfect in its simplicity, but perfection rarely survives contact with reality. A cluster of wedding guests noticed the unusual tableau: the working-class man, his modestly dressed daughter, and the CEO's disabled child sharing what looked dangerously like joy. Their whispers carried the sharp edge of social boundaries being crossed, of protocols being violated. A woman in pearls and practiced disapproval approached, her smile tight with the kind of concern that felt more like control. "Excuse me," she said to Ethan, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "but this really isn't appropriate. That's Miss Roth's daughter, and she has specific care requirements. I don't think you understand the situation." Her words were polite, but her meaning was clear. People like you don't belong here, especially not with children like her. Ethan felt the familiar burn of being dismissed, of having his worth measured by his bank account or his zip code. But Claire was watching, and Lily was listening, and sometimes the most important battles are fought not for ourselves, but for the children who need to see that kindness doesn't require permission. "I understand that she's a little girl who was sitting alone at a party," he replied quietly, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "I understand that she smiled when someone paid attention to her. And I understand that treating children like they're fragile is different from treating them like they're invisible." The woman's face flushed, and other guests began to turn, drawn by the tension in voices that were trying to remain civil. Claire had gone very still, the way children do when adults fight about them instead of with them, and Ethan realized that his defense of her was about to become another burden she'd have to carry. That's when Vivienne appeared, drawn by the commotion and the sight of her daughter surrounded by strangers. She moved through the crowd with the swift efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crises, her heels clicking against the stone terrace like a countdown. When she saw Claire at the table with Ethan and Lily, saw the paper flowers scattered between them, saw her daughter's face bright with something that looked dangerously like happiness, Vivienne felt a complex mix of relief and panic. Relief that Claire was safe, engaged, smiling; panic that a stranger had accomplished in minutes what she hadn't managed in months. But panic won, the way it always did when she felt her control slipping, and she reverted to the persona that had carried her through boardroom battles and hostile takeovers. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying the polite ice that could freeze conversations across conference tables. "But I need to take Claire now. She has a schedule, and this wasn't part of it." She moved to position herself behind Claire's wheelchair, her hands gripping the handles with more force than necessary. Ethan stood slowly, and Vivienne found herself looking up at him, taking in the worn edges of his clothes, the paint under his fingernails, the way he held himself like someone who'd learned not to expect much from people like her. She made a calculation based on appearance, on assumptions that felt safer than curiosity, and delivered the words that would haunt her for months. "My daughter doesn't need your pity, and she doesn't need a handyman lecturing me about parenting." The silence that followed was the kind that draws blood. Lily's face crumpled with the particular devastation of children who've watched their parent be publicly humiliated. Claire's smile died so completely it was like watching a light switch be turned off. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond with anger. Instead, he crouched down one more time, looked directly at Claire, and said, "It was really nice meeting you. Thank you for teaching me about paper flowers." Then he took Lily's hand and walked away, leaving Vivienne standing with her daughter in a circle of watching eyes and heavy silence. But Claire was watching Ethan leave with an expression that Vivienne had never seen before, the look of someone who'd been given a gift and then watched it be taken away. It was the look of a child who'd remembered what it felt like to be just a child, not a medical case or a source of worry or a symbol of tragedy, but simply a person worth talking to. And Vivienne, for all her success in reading people and situations, couldn't decode the devastation in her daughter's eyes or understand why her own chest felt tight with something that might have been shame. The days that followed the wedding were marked by a silence that felt different from their usual quiet. Claire, who had grown accustomed to the routines of physical therapy and tutoring sessions, now moved through her schedule with a listlessness that worried her medical team. She ate less, spoke even less, and spent hours staring out her bedroom window at the city beyond. When her nurse asked what was wrong, Claire simply shook her head. When her tutor tried to engage her in lessons, she participated with mechanical precision but no enthusiasm. It was as if something vital had been awakened at the wedding and then immediately extinguished, leaving her more aware of what was missing. Vivienne threw herself into work with renewed intensity, as if quarterly reports and acquisition deals could somehow balance the equation she couldn't solve at home. But concentration proved elusive when she kept remembering the sound of Claire's laugh, brief as it had been, genuine in a way she hadn't heard since before the accident. She found herself checking the security footage from the wedding, watching the moments when Claire's face had come alive while folding paper with Lily, seeing her daughter become animated in a way that no amount of expensive therapy had achieved. The footage was damning in its simplicity. It showed a child who'd been starving for ordinary human connection, and a mother who'd been too afraid to provide it. Late one night, unable to sleep, Vivienne stood outside Claire's bedroom door and heard her daughter talking quietly to her night nurse. "He saw me," Claire was saying, her voice carrying the weight of revelation. "Not my wheelchair, not my problems, just me. And he asked what I wanted, not what I needed." The nurse made sympathetic sounds, but Claire continued, "Mom never asks what I want anymore. She just makes sure I have everything I'm supposed to have. But I don't know what I want because nobody ever asks." Vivienne pressed her back against the hallway wall, her hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. The truth of her daughter's words hit her like a physical blow. She had become so focused on managing Claire's disability that she'd forgotten to nurture Claire's humanity. The realization that followed was both devastating and clarifying. Vivienne had spent 4 years building walls between herself and her daughter's pain, believing that professional distance would somehow protect them both. She'd hired others to provide comfort because she was terrified of failing, of saying the wrong thing, of not being enough. But in her effort to shield Claire from disappointment, she'd withheld the one thing no expert could provide: a mother's imperfect, unconditional presence. She'd been running a corporation's worth of people to care for one small girl, when what Claire needed was for her mother to simply show up, sit down, and stay. That night, Vivienne made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She would find Ethan Walsh, not to defend her actions or explain her circumstances, but to understand what he'd seen in Claire that she'd been missing. She would swallow her pride, admit her failures, and ask for help not as a CEO accustomed to purchasing solutions, but as a mother who'd lost her way. It would mean acknowledging that love wasn't always about providing the best of everything, but sometimes about being willing to provide the most important thing: yourself, flawed and frightened and present. The next morning dawned gray and uncertain, matching the weather in Vivienne's chest as she drove through parts of the city she'd only seen from highway overpasses. The GPS led her through neighborhoods where houses sat close together, where children's bicycles leaned against chain-link fences, where laundry hung on lines instead of disappearing into machines operated by housekeeping staff. She felt like an alien in her luxury sedan, conscious of how her clothes, her car, her entire presentation marked her as an outsider. But she kept driving because turning back would mean accepting that the gulf between their worlds was unbridgeable, and Claire's future happiness might depend on proving that assumption wrong. Ethan's building was a 3-story brick structure with flower boxes and some windows and a playground across the street where children played while their parents watched from benches. Vivienne sat in her car for several minutes, rehearsing what she might say, before realizing that this wasn't a business meeting that could be scripted and controlled. She was about to ask a stranger to help her learn how to be a mother to her own child, and no amount of preparation could make that conversation easy. When she finally knocked on apartment 2B, she heard footsteps and children's voices, and then Ethan opened the door with the expression of someone who'd been expecting anyone but her. "Miss Roth," he said, and his voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. Behind him, she could see a small apartment that looked lived in rather than decorated, comfortable rather than impressive. Lily appeared at his elbow, curious and cautious, her eyes wide at seeing the elegant woman from the wedding standing in their doorway. Vivienne had prepared several opening lines, professional approaches to what felt like a negotiation, but what came out was simpler and more honest than anything she'd planned. "I'm not here to fix anything. I'm here to start over." Ethan studied her face for a long moment, seeing something there that made him step aside and gesture toward their small kitchen table. As Vivienne sat down, she noticed details that spoke of a life lived with attention. drawings held to the refrigerator with magnets, a half-finished jigsaw puzzle on a side table, books with cracked spines that had clearly been read multiple times. This was what a home looked like when someone was actually living in it, rather than just maintaining it. Lily hovered nearby, torn between curiosity and the protective instincts children develop when they sense their parent has been hurt. Claire hasn't spoken since the wedding, Vivienne began, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly around the coffee mug Ethan had offered. I mean, she answers questions, follows instructions, participates in her therapies. But she's not really there anymore. And I realize that I don't know how to reach her because I've been so busy protecting her that I forgot how to connect with her. She looked up at Ethan, her composure cracking slightly. I don't know what you did in those few minutes, but you reminded her of something I made her forget, and I need to understand what that was. Ethan sat across from her, and his response surprised her with its gentleness rather than accusation. I didn't do anything special, he said. I just treated her like a person instead of a condition. I asked what she wanted instead of what she needed. I assumed she had opinions and preferences and the right to make choices about small things, like whether she wanted to learn origami. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Claire isn't fragile because she uses a wheelchair. She's lonely because she's been isolated from ordinary experiences in the name of keeping her safe. The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours and changed both of their lives. Vivienne found herself telling Ethan about the accident, about the guilt that had driven her to hire teams of experts rather than trust her own instincts, about the fear that she wasn't enough to help her daughter heal. Ethan shared his own struggles with single parenthood, with the weight of being someone's entire world, with the daily balance between protection and independence that every parent had to navigate. They discovered that despite their different circumstances, they were both wrestling with the same fundamental question: how do you love someone enough to let them risk being hurt? When Vivienne finally asked if he and Lily would consider joining her and Claire for dinner, it wasn't as CEO of Rothtech making a business proposition. It was as a mother admitting she needed help learning how to be present in her own daughter's life. Ethan's yes was equally simple, offered not because he was impressed by her wealth or status, but because he'd seen Claire's face at the wedding and understood that some children's happiness was worth crossing social boundaries to protect. The Saturday dinners that followed became an experiment in creating family from unexpected pieces. Vivienne's penthouse, usually sterile in its perfection, gradually came alive with the chaos of actual living. Claire began speaking more, asking questions, expressing preferences about food and activities and how she wanted to spend her time. She taught Lily about the adaptive technologies she used, while Lily taught Claire card games and showed her how to braid friendship bracelets. The two girls created elaborate imaginary worlds during their play, stories where differences were adventures rather than limitations. The adults learned to navigate their own growing connection with careful attention to their daughter's needs. Vivienne discovered that she enjoyed cooking when it meant creating something together rather than simply providing nutrition. She and Lily spent one memorable afternoon attempting to bake cookies, resulting in a kitchen disaster that left them both covered in flour and laughing helplessly. Ethan found himself becoming Claire's unofficial consultant on accessibility improvements around the penthouse. Small modifications that increased her independence while teaching Vivienne to see her environment through her daughter's eyes. More importantly, Vivienne began learning how to be present without an agenda. She sat with Claire during afternoon rest periods, not to monitor her condition, but simply to be available if conversation arose. She discovered that her daughter had opinions about books, preferences about music, and dreams about travel that had nothing to do with medical considerations. Claire wanted to see the ocean, learn to paint watercolors, and maybe get a dog someday. These were ordinary childhood desires that had been buried under layers of therapeutic objectives and safety protocols. One evening, while the girls worked on a puzzle in the living room, Claire accidentally knocked over a glass of water. Vivienne's first instinct was to call for towels, to manage the situation efficiently, but Claire's expression stopped her. Her daughter was waiting for the familiar pattern, the rush to clean up, the gentle scolding disguised as concern, the reminder to be more careful. Instead, Vivienne simply handed Claire some napkins and said, "Happens to everyone. The puzzle pieces will dry." It was a small moment, but Claire's smile suggested it felt revolutionary. The friendship between Lily and Claire deepened in ways that surprised all the adults. Lily, who had always been somewhat shy and careful, became more confident in her role as Claire's friend and occasional advocate. When they visited the park and other children stared at Claire's wheelchair, Lily simply introduced her friend and invited others to join their games. Claire, who had grown accustomed to being treated as fragile, began asserting herself more, asking to try new activities and expressing frustration when adults made decisions based on assumptions rather than her actual capabilities. They developed rituals that belonged to them alone. Saturday morning pancakes where everyone contributed one ingredient, evening walks around the neighborhood where Claire could practice navigating different terrains, and Sunday afternoon art projects that resulted in masterpieces worthy of refrigerator display. Vivienne found herself looking forward to these times with an anticipation she hadn't felt since before the accident, when Claire's laughter had been the soundtrack to her happiness. The crisis that tested their newfound equilibrium came on a sunny Tuesday afternoon in the park. Claire had been working with her physical therapist on transferring from her wheelchair to park benches, building strength and confidence in her mobility. She'd been making excellent progress, and when she saw a paper airplane caught in a low tree branch, she decided to attempt the transfer on her own. The bench was slightly higher than the ones she'd practiced with, and when she reached for the airplane, she lost her balance and fell to the ground. The fall itself wasn't serious, resulting in scraped palms and wounded pride rather than actual injury. But Claire's reaction was immediate and intense. She wanted her mother, not her therapist, not the concerned strangers who gathered to help, not even Ethan, who had rushed over from across the playground. She wanted Vivienne, who was 50 yards away taking a business call that had seemed important until she heard her daughter calling for her. The sound cut through every other priority, and Vivienne found herself dropping her phone and running in a way she hadn't run since childhood, her heels discarded somewhere between the bench and her daughter's side. When she reached Claire, Vivienne didn't assess the damage or ask medical questions or call for professional assistance. She simply dropped to her knees on the playground mulch, gathered her daughter into her arms, and held her while Claire cried against her shoulder. "I'm here," Vivienne whispered, rocking slightly. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Claire's tears weren't really about the fall. They were about months of stored-up fear and loneliness, and the relief of finally having her mother catch her when she fell, literally and figuratively. The incident marked a turning point in their relationship. Claire began taking more risks, knowing that her mother would be there to help her handle the consequences, rather than prevent all possibility of failure. Vivienne began trusting her instincts more, understanding that love sometimes meant allowing controlled dangers in service of growth and independence. She took a leave of absence from Rothtech, the first vacation she'd taken since Claire's accident, to focus on learning how to be present in her daughter's daily life. During these weeks together, Vivienne discovered aspects of motherhood she'd forgotten she enjoyed. She learned Claire's preferences for bedtime stories, her theories about why clouds moved, her detailed plans for the treehouse she wanted to build someday. They developed inside jokes and secret traditions, the small intimacies that make families feel like home to each other. Claire began laughing more frequently, the rusty quality replaced by something bright and genuine and utterly her own. Ethan watched this transformation with the satisfaction of someone who'd helped heal something that needed healing. His own relationship with Lily deepened as well, as she gained confidence from her friendship with Claire and from seeing how adults could model healthy relationships across difference. The four of them had become something unprecedented in all their lives. A chosen family that worked not because it fit conventional definitions, but because it met everyone's needs for connection, growth, and belonging. When Claire asked if she could try attending regular school one day per week, Vivienne's first impulse was to catalog all the potential problems and complications. But Claire's expression was so hopeful, and her reasons so sound, that Vivienne found herself saying yes before her fears could construct objections. The trial run was successful enough to expand to 2 days, then 3, with Claire navigating both the social and academic challenges with increasing confidence. She made friends who saw her wheelchair as simply one characteristic among many, no more defining than hair color or favorite subject. 1 year after the wedding that had brought them together, they found themselves at another celebration, the marriage of Vivienne's business partner, someone who had watched the transformation in both Vivienne and Claire with amazement and approval. This time, there was no question of anyone sitting alone or being overlooked. Claire and Lily had appointed themselves as unofficial wedding coordinators for younger guests, organizing games and activities that included everyone regardless of their abilities or circumstances. When the band began playing for dancing, Claire surprised everyone by wheeling herself to the center of the floor and beckoning for Lily to join her. The other guests paused to watch as the two girls began moving to the music, Claire's chair spinning and gliding while Lily danced beside her, their movements synchronized by friendship rather than choreography. Other children joined them, then adults, until the dance floor filled with people moving together in celebration. Ethan approached Vivienne, who was watching from the sidelines with tears in her eyes. "Care to dance?" he asked, offering his hand. As they moved together, Vivienne realized that this was what healing looked like. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of people willing to face difficulties together. Claire caught her eye from the dance floor and grinned, her happiness so radiant that several guests turned to see what was lighting up the room. "Mr. Ethan," Claire called over the music, "you forgot your part." She gestured for him to join their small circle, and then looked expectantly at her mother. Vivienne stepped forward without hesitation, taking her place in the group as they swayed together to the slow song that had just begun. Four people who had found each other across the vast spaces of difference and circumstance, creating something that looked nothing like conventional family but felt exactly like home. As the music played, Vivienne thought about the question that had started it all. Why is she alone? The answer had turned out to be more complex than anyone had imagined, involving not just Claire's isolation, but the isolation that all of them had experienced in different ways. Ethan had been alone with the weight of single parenthood and economic insecurity. Lily had been alone with her natural shyness and limited social opportunities. Vivienne had been alone with her guilt and fear of failing her daughter again. And Claire had been alone with her needs in a world that preferred to meet them from a professional distance. But they weren't alone anymore. They had created something new, a family defined not by blood or law, but by choice, commitment, and the daily decision to show up for each other's joys and struggles. Claire was still disabled, but she was no longer defined by her disability. Vivienne was still a successful businesswoman, but she was no longer hiding behind her success. Ethan was still working class, but he was no longer apologizing for his circumstances. Lily was still sometimes shy, but she was no longer shrinking from new experiences. The song ended, and the dance floor began to fill with other couples, but the four of them remained in their small circle for a moment longer. Claire reached up to take her mother's hand, Lily grabbed Ethan's, and they stood together in the middle of the celebration, surrounded by music and laughter and the warm glow of string lights, no longer asking why anyone should be alone, because they had found the answer in each other. Some families are born, others are made, and the very best ones are chosen daily through small acts of love and larger acts of courage, by people brave enough to see past surface differences to the fundamental human need for connection, belonging, and the simple recognition that everyone deserves to be seen, valued, and included in the dance.